Hi, my name is Erica Ritter. I'm a volunteer at the Animal Protection Party, and I'm also a writer. And I'm here to introduce and discuss with a wonderful group of women, all involved with the environment, the Animal Protection Party, to talk about the connection between women as activists in the animal advocacy movement and International Women's Day, which is something celebrated by all women, but maybe most particularly by women like us. Uh, Before we commence the discussion, let me introduce the wonderful group of people with me. Liz White, who is the leader of the Animal Protection Party, Lia Laskaris, who is the treasurer of the Animal Protection Party, Verena Besso, who is a researcher and a volunteer and a retired nurse, and Twyla Francois, who's and her animal companion there, who is involved in the also as a research associate with the Animal Protection Party, and also somebody who has had long years of advocacy, literally in the field, in terms of supporting animals, principally livestock, but also other animals. And the reason that I am so engaged with this issue at the moment is because there is room, within the animal advocacy movement for people who are both active in a direct way and also people who are involved in the issues of the movement and who are interested, as I am, in the history of it. And I think women have always had a particular affinity for animal protection, for concerns about animals, for advocating for animals, because I think there is a real sense of identification between women and animals. I mean, there certainly are strong men in this movement, but I think there's a particular sympathetic chord that animals strike in women because there is a shared history in a lot of ways, a kind of sense of both animals and women as not a silent majority, not silent by choice, but maybe a voiceless majority. And that in giving voice to our own causes, women have always wanted to also give voice to the causes of animals who can't speak in our languages. And I know as a writer, I've been inspired by other women who use their writing in order to discuss these issues. As far back as the 17th century, Margaret Cavendish, who was a British poet who wrote a poem called A Hunting of the Hare, where it's clear that she identifies this prey animal being pursued relentlessly and heartlessly by this troop of hunters, that it is a very male and female situation. Anna Sewell, who wrote the classic Black Beauty, wrote the book in order to speak for horses, and she speaks as a horse. And a lot of the issues that were rampant in London in her day, particularly check reins, painful check reins on horses, the terrible life of cab and cart horses in London, were the subjects of her writing and also the advocacy of her life. And as well, I mean, certainly the suffragist movement in England and France and North America, there's always been this kind of union among the ideas of animal protection, abolition of slavery, and also the voice for women in terms of the vote. They've always, women interested in one issue have often been interested in all the others, to the extent that one of the great suffragists of France, Marie Huot, went to Louis Pasteur's clinic. This is in the 1880s, and he was already an eminent scientist, and protested against vivisection. Went back later to his laboratory and hit another of his researchers with an umbrella because he was vivisecting a monkey. And she also wrote about these issues, as did a number of suffragette women in the United States and Canada, and also in England and France. So it's to me a real natural bond. And I think it's important to talk about both the ideas behind it and the action in the field. And Liz White, who's the leader of this party and also an aspiring figure in the animal advocacy movement, has some thoughts too, I'm sure.
Thank you, Erica. I guess just in thinking about doing this round table, I was thinking back to people that I've had experience with over the 35 or 40 years that I've been doing this. And I think it's important to recognize these people because, and maybe it's because we're women, but we don't really document our history. Things happen and it's not really written about. So I thought I'd just remind people that when I started, it was back at the Toronto Humane Society. And when I got there, there had been a revolution at the Toronto Humane Society, and the board was taken over by animal rights activists. And they had the audacity to say, well, we shouldn't be eating meat and we shouldn't wear leather and fur should be out. And by the way, we shouldn't research on animals. And the person that was sort of the leader in that was Vicki Miller, which maybe a lot of people don't remember. She was there for a very short period of time, but she was explosive, dynamite, articulate, and she really catapulted the animal rights movement, I think, into to make it very much more available to people and popular and much more well known because of her controversy. The second person that I would really like to talk about is Stephanie Brown, who was involved really before Vicki Miller took over the Toronto Humane Society. Stephanie worked at the Toronto Humane Society and at the Canadian Federation of Humane Societies. She sat on the Canadian Council of Animal Care. So she's had a very long history of operating in a system that was largely male dominated and really dismissed female opinions about, say, protocols for research animals and so on and so forth. So in a way, Stephanie was cutting edge in occupying that position and challenging the males around the table in the various entities that she was involved in. And I think has made a real difference ultimately in the world for us and for the animals, and has really brought, we've really benefited from the actions of those women. And it's become much more mainstream to be an animal rights woman.
Yes, and she also, of course, is the Canadian Coalition for Farm Animals. And in that capacity, I mean, Stephanie has gone to meetings of the shareholders of Loblaws to stand up and insist that they advocate for free range eggs, and has made, you know, a dent at levels that are are notable. And she is tireless and has been tireless, has been on animal care committees for the Canadian Council on Animal Care, and has had to stand up to a lot of people. And Verena, that I know you know certainly something about this, because you and I both worked on documentation that involves some of Stephanie's experiences, and you have your own experiences too.
Yeah, I think I'm hearing what both of you have said thus far. I think I'm struck with trying to figure out, it's not a coincidence that the animal rights movement and environmental movements in the larger sphere are women are overrepresented in those fields. And I think it's quite important to figure out why that is. We can go back into the history, we can go back into the philosophy, and my take on it most recently is that even here in Canada, where we're blessed with having far more rights than billions of other women around the world, we've only had a voice for about a century. So there's a long, long history of us women, we women, us, grammatical, not having a voice. So that identification with others that are voiceless, with the plight of children and societies for the protection of children and societies for the protection of animals, were often founded by the same people at the same time. So those voiceless people, I would say that we have a long history of sharing that condition. So it really is quite remarkable that what we have been able to accomplish in that short century. And furthermore, I think we just really need to drive it forward and keep working at it and encourage those in power, which to the largest extent is still white males, encourage those in power to be able to identify similarly with the weaker, the more oppressed. And instead of accepting a criticism that, oh, women are too emotional, we're too hysterical, we're too sensitive, we should cherish and feel empowered by our ability to sympathize and empathize and try to bring others who don't yet have that ability along with us. We are the ones with the strength to feel for others, and those who don't yet have that should be learning from us. So it's our responsibility to drive this forward.
Yeah, and also, I mean, like every other movement, however liberated in many ways, the animal movement has been dominated by men, at least in the top echelons, the famous names in animal advocacy and animal philosophy, like Peter Singer, like Gary Francione, like Tom Regan and others, Stephen Wise, and you know, a whole bunch in both in America and in England. And yet the real driving forces in the field are women. And even within movements like ours, there is that sense that women have to fight not only for the animals, but also in a way for themselves. And Twyla, I know you've been out there, like literally, as I said, in the field, advocating for animals, and I know you've had to deal with attitudes because you're a woman in this posture of protection.
Yeah, and I think to me, although it's been difficult working at this from being a female, it also helps me empathize with the animals on a level that I probably wouldn't otherwise. Sorry, are you hearing him snore?
Yes, but we should just say that it's your dear little pug who wandered in earlier, and yes, he's now snoring away.
This is the
but I know he's
the
interested.
noise.
He's interested. He's not bored.
Yes.
Sorry, go
but
on.
yeah, so it's also sort of a, like we were talking about, a power as well, that we can recognize suffering and empathize in a way that most of the men that are in this industry seem kind of oblivious about. And maybe I can just give one example. She was a dairy cow that I found at a livestock auction, and she was in terrible condition. She had advanced mastitis, and it was so bad that the ligaments that held her udder up had ruptured. So it was literally dragging on the ground. She had a twisted stomach and was in excruciating pain. Her abdomen was, gathering. She was becoming acidic. And I know this because I called the people in the province that are responsible for ensuring the welfare of these animals, which is the Office of the Chief Veterinarian. So I had called that office right from day one to have them come down, have a look at her, hopefully euthanize her, because that's generally the best that we can get done. And he finally did come out on day 2, and he told me all of the conditions that she was suffering from, said she was in extreme pain, and then proceeded to leave. And so I had to return again the next day, and finally on day 3, but in the meantime, they dragged her through the auction ring. She had been bought by a slaughterhouse in the US, and she was only going to be transported 2 weeks from that day. So she was going to be left completely untreated in that condition. So he finally did euthanize her. And it was still early in my career as an investigator, where I was still quite hopeful that they were going to do the right thing, that they were going to lay charges. Even at the time, under the legislation, it was illegal to transport her. It was illegal for the auction to accept her. It was illegal to drag her through the livestock auction ring. It would have been illegal to load her again. So I assumed charges were forthcoming. And I'd had quite a good relationship with the chief veterinarian at the time. And so it was surprising a couple of months later when I went to a conference for farmed animals. The industry puts these on to make it look like they are concerned about the welfare of these animals, and still being green, I went thinking, oh, this is great. And I saw him actually in the lobby, the chief veterinarian. And I went up to him and was like, oh, hey, I didn't know you'd be here, and was being very friendly. And I could see he was very uncomfortable, but he said, oh, stick around, you'll want to hear my talk. And so I stuck around, I heard his talk, and it consisted of him putting up a picture in front of this room full of men, producers in muddy boots. They've just come from their pig farms, put up a photo on his slide of me and the cow, and he proceeded to mock me. And he stirred up the audience to such a degree that the men were stomping their filthy boots on the ground and staring at me. And the purpose of his talk was really to mock me for having the audacity to name her, give her a name, and to imbue her with any kind of sense of emotions or the fact that she could feel pain. And he's a veterinarian. He was the chief veterinarian of the province at the time, in charge of enforcing regulations for farmed animals. Yeah. And so to me, it was a really hard lesson on that the people in power are not enforcing any regulations at all, but also that that just recognizing that there's worth in all of these animals is somehow something that we should be ashamed about. So that was one.
And the fact that you were a woman, I mean, had you been a man who was advocating for the cow and had given her a name, just to give her a name, what would the chief veterinarian have said about it at the conference?
Yeah, I don't think he would have put a fellow's photo up and mocked him. But it was interesting because it's like when Jane Goodall also had, not that I'm comparing myself to Jane Goodall in any way, but she had also talked about in her presentations that she was mocked for naming the chimpanzees that she was dealing with. And I mean, that's our closest relative. But she was such a groundbreaker on doing that and sticking to it and not backing down.
Well, not naming the animal is something that they have to do, isn't it, in order to separate in their mind the value of this being. I mean, humans were given numbers, multiple times throughout history in order to disregard their humanness. Mm-hmm. And so I'm not surprised that for a woman to name another being and to give her worth and to recognize that value, I assume is very threatening for a man who maybe is not able to express his feelings openly, who isn't able to verbalize any of those feelings if he does have them. I'm not surprised. It's disappointing, of course, but it shows how long away we have to go, how much work we have to do.
Yeah, and as Verena was saying, about how women have always been recognized for this kind of nurturing role, it's also a convenient way to kind of, shove women off to the side, as sentimental or as kind of foolish or impractical, and men have to, consciously maybe, part of the mockery of those men of Twyla, the stomping of the feet, the kind of real anger would be kind of trying to stomp feelings out of themselves, maybe, like not wanting to acknowledge, not wanting to not be a guy, a tough guy about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think very valuable reading for everybody. It's been around for decades now, is The Sexual Politics of Meat, that really makes that strong connection, joins the circles about the attitude towards women, towards property, the commodification, and you know, it's part and parcel of a patriarchal power structure. Not to wander too far into those political minefields, but yeah, and for men to express the same level of caring and sympathy and empathy can be a rough road for some of them. You know, they can be accused of being sissies and what have you, because it's considered a female trait to be nurturing and to be caring. And what does that say about humans? Wow, it says a lot.
I think we're so far in the weeds, though, like in our daily work, that we often have a hard time seeing the progress that's being made.
You're absolutely right, yes.
Yeah. So, for example, I recall a conversation I had one time with a volunteer about 10 years ago. And he said, he had commented, because he was older, he had commented how different my generation is, because, you know, back in his day, it would be very odd to see a man pushing a baby carriage down the street, for example. People would think there's a problem, this isn't his baby, you know, whatever they might be thinking at the time. Nowadays, it's very common. You know, there's no concern, you know, it's the father or, you know, the nanny or whatever the case might be. And he's responsible for that child. And it's not, and, you know, people don't question it anymore. It took so long. I'm sure people were stunned at how long it took to get to that point. But of course, you know, our values in the so-called West have changed. And I think we are gradually seeing that change with animals, but it is very difficult for those of us in this advocacy work to see it.
I think also, you know, the whole business of men being allowed to have feelings about animals. I mean, the sort of the classics of children's literature often is about, you know, how you have to matriculate to manhood by having to kill the thing you love. Like The Yearling, you know, wonderful, wonderful novel about a boy raising a fawn, and he raises the fawn because his father had to kill the mother in order to have a poultice for a snake bite that he had. So the boy begs to take home the fawn, raises it, the animal becomes destructive, and ultimately the boy, has to shoot the fawn. It's a wonderful, compassionate novel written by a woman. But it's like another novel, similarly in Old Yeller, which is written by a man, but very compassionate book about, you know, a boy in Texas whose life is saved initially by this dog, and in the end the dog becomes rabid and he has to shoot the dog. And you know, it's one of those classic scenes both in the Disney film where they, at the end, of course, they provide a puppy, you know, sort of to kind of, you know, the circle of death and birth is, but in the novel they don't really. I mean, he has to go and shoot the dog, and yet it's both his sensitivity, but also the kind of male responsibility and the necessity to do this. And I mean, I think we're still kind of dealing with that, where men are put into this dual role, where even the, you know, the ability to be compassionate, the ability to identify with animals is limited by the you know, the ultimate recognition that they have to be in charge and they have to, you know, be the administrator and do things, even executions when necessary.
I also think that given, well, particularly in farmed animal issues, when Stephanie Brown and I sat through the Maple Lodge Farms court case for 2 years, we experienced numbers that we hadn't even considered, that they slaughter 300 to 500,000 chickens a day. And then you see the film that Mercy for Animals did. I think it was Mercy for Animals that did an undercover investigation of Maple Lodge Farms. And it's men, you know, taking chickens out of crates, hanging them up, throwing the dead ones in the dumpster and so on and so forth. And you look at the numbers that they do and you think, I can't even get my head around what that does to someone emotionally, to have to turn off the life of 300,000 chickens in a day. Like it just is mind boggling. So I think, you know, that's why we see in the industry that people who are on the are newcomers to Canada are often the employees of these places because they need the job and they need, but you know, I do feel for them because it's kind of soul crushing just to watch that whole thing evolve. So yeah, and a lot of the people on the line, aside from the managers, are women.
Mhm.
What's interesting, you just reminded me of, I was thinking about a discussion over the past while about the connection between animal abuse and cruelty and spousal abuse and cruelty later on in life for people. And that we now have enough data to show a pattern. And people have been saying this for quite some time now, but we finally have the science to validate those lived experiences of people. And so I think it's so important. We're in a spot in history now where we have an opportunity. You know, people in my generation have are fortunate enough to have so much more than people previously. And it's, I think, incumbent on us to take every opportunity we have, you know, to do all we can for things that we're passionate about in this particular and it's especially in this particular field of work for the voiceless. You know, I find it's what's impressive to me, what's so inspiring to me with the party is seeing people now who want to be part of it, who are willing to put their name on the ballot and put themselves out there, because being a candidate is not easy. You know, first of all, it's difficult because you're a woman. And second of all, you're going to be challenging people, the status quo, and you're putting a target on your back. I mean, it's really a difficult thing to do. And to talk to people about these new ideas that we have and encouraging them to extend that circle of compassion. That's what it's all about, right? It's not just compassion for each other, but compassion for other species and the earth in general. It's a really, the message is so comprehensive and so wide ranging, but it's an important message. And I'm so inspired by all the people who are part of our party and worldwide, all the parties worldwide. There are so many women now who have seats. It's really incredible to see what they're doing.
Yes, I agree. That's really good to hear, to remind ourselves of the positives and the progress that has been made. And I certainly fall victim too often to walking around rather glumly, but a lot has happened, and a lot more will inevitably continue to happen given the passion and the commitment that are demonstrated in the movement.
I think we have a really interesting fight coming up, and that's with the Department of National Defense. And I think it's interesting because the minister is a woman, and a very powerful woman in the cabinet. But the vast majority of people below her are men who are in the Army and the Navy and the Air Force and all those things, and have understood that you obey orders. And so that mix of appealing to the minister to bring out her compassionate self when we're talking about the animals that are used for live trauma training, against a whole cadre of men who are saying, no, we have to do this. What do you know? You're not in the Army or whatever. So I think it'll be a really interesting fight to see that go forward.
And I think also, sorry, I think also for a woman in that position, you know, it's like women in executive roles where, you know, they wear the tailored suit and the big shoulder pads, and to be kind of more, not masculine, but more, you know, forceful even than any of the men, and the temptation to have to go that route instead of using the aspects of yourself that are female and instinctually sensitive to these things, and having to either tamp them down or, you know, push them forward, but with huge resistance. No, I think it will be interesting. Sorry, Lia.
That's okay. I was just going to say, I do find it interesting that that Trudeau made the cabinet, designed it the way he did. And I was thinking back to that time where he held a town hall, and our deputy leader, Jordan Riker, attended, and was fortunate enough to be able to ask a question to the Prime Minister, and introduced himself as a deputy leader of a party, and, you know, made a joke about, you know, being a leader of a party. And Trudeau had to denigrate him. And I don't know if that was because Jordan was, you know, a young, good-looking person. Maybe it was because he was there to represent animals, and so the subject matter was challenging. Maybe it's all of those things. But Trudeau's response was to mock him, to call him a suit and tie activist. And I thought, boy, had he been a woman, would have he made a comment like that, or how else could he have denigrated that person, you know, and shut down that conversation? He was very skilled at shutting down that conversation, just with that one offhand comment, you know, that very dismissive comment that you don't know what you're talking about, you're just a suit and tie activist.
Really? Yeah. I mean, from a guy in a suit and tie too, right? And hardly an activist. Yeah, no, I didn't know that. But that's an interesting question. He might even, you know, have been more kind of courteous to a woman and assumed that it was okay for a woman to be representing something as squishy as, you know, an animal organization, but whereas a guy in a suit and tie should be kind of about something more manly. I don't know.
I would say, from observation of the current Liberal Party, that it's no accident that in the mandate letters, several mandate letters, that there's a mention of ending cosmetic testing, and sort of looking at the animal issue, talking about the horses that are transported to Japan for food and stuff. And if you look at the makeup of the cabinet, there are some very powerful women who are in very powerful positions in that cabinet. And I think as a result of that, we see a little bit different dynamic in the Liberal Party, open to looking at doing maybe some tiny little steps to protect animals in certain areas.
I hope you're right. I really do hope you're right.
So do I.
One of the things that I would really like to see change is, you know, once women become, oftentimes when women enter positions of power, they just turn into female men, if you know what I mean. And they have to be tougher and harder than the guys in order to rise above. And that's always, that's clearly a sad trajectory to have to take. Yeah, the women succeeding in a men's world, I think I've talked about this before, the extolling of the achievements of women succeeding in a men's world need to be matched by a similar extolling of a successful man in a female dominated world. I'm talking early childhood education, I'm talking primary teaching, nursing, the traditional female dominated realms. A woman who becomes the head of NASA, woo, everybody's really excited, as they should be. It's a wonderful achievement. But a man becoming a successful early childhood educator, taking care of society's most important resource, supposedly, that is not happening. And until it does, until both ends of the spectrum are similarly lauded and applauded and celebrated, I think we're going to be having International Women's Day forever, rather than International Humans Celebrating All Life Day, something like that.
Right, or International Humans and Animals Day, or
Yeah, that's a
something
good one.
like that,
Like
which
that. Mhm.
that would be good.
What you said, Verena, about a woman becoming a man, it reminded me of an issue when you were working, Liz, on deer. I can't remember if it was Iroquois Heights. It was somewhere in Ontario, and you had been on this committee and were advocating for non-lethal, intervention for the problems that were happening in the community with the deer. And the committee had brought in a scientist who was known to be not on the side of deer, who would prefer to protect, this bush here and that trillium there. And at one time when she attended the committee, her presentation was to mock you and to call you a Bambi lover, and why don't you care about rats the same way that you care about deer, and all of that sort of thing. And it was not a very scientific presentation at all. And fortunately, we had a scientist who happened to be male, who was able to present to the committee and refute everything that she had said, to give the committee better information about what was actually happening in that community.
Yeah, I've been in a number of committees with both men, but largely men, really, not usually women, who, just like Twyla, experienced just utterly derogatory about who you are, what they think you stand for. Why have you devoted your life to this silly cause? Like, that kind of thing. I remember I sat on a trapping committee. It was dealing with the international trapping standards, and Canada was to align itself with that. So we got into talking about how long it took to drown a beaver, how long, we went through all of those various things. And of course, I was there, and we were, I was pounding the table and saying, you can't call that, 20 minutes for a beaver to drown is not humane, blah, blah, blah. And I came down the next day, and there was this picture of a wolf with earrings, and I was called the bitch. That was the statement at the committee. So that was the venue in which we fought, right? But anyway, I sort of took it as a badge of honor that I had riled them up enough that they had to actually do some sort of silly nonsense and try and denigrate me. But yeah.
But
anyway.
It's good that it's so good that you took it that way, though. Like I think about how many women in our movement have been pushed out or just beaten up so badly that they really had to get out of the movement for their own sanity.
Yep.
And and one other issue I think we have to face right now is we're fighting such huge battles from the outside, but internally as well as a movement. We need to really be careful with how we're elevating men in the movement and giving them an incredible platform, and that it's ripe for exploitation. And we're seeing that now, with a number of cases where really well-known male leading animal rights activists are being accused and being found to be responsible for doing really horrendous things against female activists.
Right.
And right now, we're facing in Canada a male activist who it was well known for sexual harassment, sexual assault. He even openly admitted it in one of his videos, and yet he is suing the Save movement and Anita for $1.2 million for putting out notification to their members saying, please be aware of this guy. We banned him from all of our events. So it's also a big area that we need to be thinking about as activists, as how do we protect women in our own movement from within ourselves even.
How we create a safe environment that we can even if we go to meetings in which we're denigrated or we feel like we might not be so safe, that we can figure out how to produce a safe environment for people who do that kind of work. Because I do agree, I think, you know, most people who are called all sorts of names, like I've been called over the years, would just back away,
Yeah.
disappear. And I think that's, you know, that's a terrible shame, because we all need to fight. As women fought in the past for voting and all sorts of different things, we have the same responsibility now. We have actually, if you dig deep, we all have the power to do that. And I think most of us have the determination to do it. And so, you know, I hope that the movement, you know, helps people along as opposed to becoming divisive. And the second thing I hope in the movement, that women take politics seriously. And I understand you're in the political venue, you're going into the same thing in a way as you go into a slaughterhouse and fight with the guys, right? It's a similar dynamic. But, you know, when you think about it, those guys have the power to make it better for animals everywhere. And so the more people, the more women who come to our party and who run and talk about this stuff, I think it'll begin to change the political dynamic as well.
I agree.
Yeah, I was gonna say that's a perfect note to end on.
I think so. I think we should. I think it's called quitting while you're ahead.
Yes.
Yeah.